Thank you, Andreas. It's an absolute delight to be here. Andreas said he was going to tell about a story of when one of the first times we met, and he was nursing a very nasty hangover after the then version of Club Night, which was a bit more fierce than the one now. And we were both sitting in the same jumping around airplane, and I was apparently very concerned. I'm glad to know that I was very gentle to him and kept checking whether he was going to be okay and survive this short flight. So I am aware that there was Club Night last night, and I'll try to be gentle on if some of you are nursing hangovers. And I'm going to give a talk that's really more about trying to abstract principles of cognition rather than sort of getting too stuck into the nitty-gritty of some of the methodological details. So, preperception is what I'm going to talk about. I don't need to tell this crowd, obviously, that the brain is not an idle or passive organ, but instead is full of dynamic activity, even at rest. So even from the first recordings of the human brain made by Hans Berger, he didn't notice the brain just flatlining or idle, but he actually described several rhythms that were ongoing in the brain, which in turn correlated with the state of individuals as well as with some types of conditions, medical conditions. And then I think the hemodynamic-based imaging methods like PET and MRI have really sort of changed our paradigm of thought about the human brain, showing us that, again, the brain at rest is not sort of in some kind of jumble of activity, but instead takes this activity in the form of sort of structured, organized networks. So first, with Reikel's group kind of puzzling over this problem of the baseline state and identifying the default mode network, and then the realization that the default mode network is just one of many different networks that the brain is kind of cycling through and working through at rest. And this is an example from Steve Smith's group's work. And nowadays, of course, we can look at these networks switching around dynamically in time. So like the work of Mark Woolrich showing that you can actually chart these with MEG changing over the couple of 100 millisecond time scale. But the talk that I want to give today is about how all this activity is not just a way of the brain sort of keeping itself alive and cycling through and doing some homeostatic cleanup or oiling through the networks, but actually activity that in the brain all the time is highly structured, proactive, and dynamic, and it's actually there guiding our perception and action all the time. So again, I don't have to tell this crowd that there are predictive signals and that these guide adaptive behavior. There are two really major sort of domains of inquiry that deal with this issue. One of them, very popular nowadays, is the predictive coding paradigm. And under predictive coding, we know that prior information can help attenuate processing of things that one already knows and expects. And I would say that this is something that happens prevalently when an organism or an individual is exploring or learning about the environment. A complementary field is the field of attention. And in the field of attention, we understand a lot of how these prior signals, how this knowledge that's stored in the brain and generated sometimes moment to moment, how instead they help enhance and amplify our perception and action. So for example, arguably, if you're trying to perform neurosurgery, you want to use your prior information to make sure that you are absolutely spot on with what you're doing and not sort of attenuate the processing of the target organ that you're dealing with. And similarly, arguably, if you're playing sports and all these prior anticipatory mechanisms will help you perceive and act upon information readily. And it does so by enhancing the way the brain works. So unlike our kind of intuition that reality starts outside and somehow it kind of comes in and gets increasingly integrated into our brain and from which we construct ever more associative and abstract representations and store them in short-term and then long-term memory, what we've learned from the field of attention and based on some intuitions that have been around for a very long time is that this preperception, which is a term by Lewis in 1877 that William James borrowed from as this excitation from the ideational centers, that this Organic adjustment, then, and ideational preparation or preperception is concerned in all attentive acts. And the notion we have now is that rather than things coming out from the outside in, what also happens is that this preperception or this ideational preparation feeds back into the, struggling with this pointer here, feeds back to influence perception from very early stages. And from the field of attention, we know that these goal-based representations influence information processing, and we know we have this kind of very successful field, I would say, the field of attention, which has spans from theoretical and computational models, human large-scale network imaging and electrophysiology in human, all the way down to cellular mechanisms, in a fairly harmonious way to give us a textbook story. The model that we have from that is that we have a large-scale network. This network was actually originally proposed by Marcel Messelam in 1981, so the same Messelam that was telling us about language yesterday. He's also done a lot of really pioneering work in the attention field. And very similar to models proposed by Posner, obviously before any imaging, human brain imaging was around. And these networks bring together sort of perceptual saliency, intentional action-related and motivational information together to provide these top-down biasing signals, which then influence what we know to be a very competitive process during information process within the sensory streams. So this is a very famous and dominant kind of idea by Desimone and Duncan, the biased competition model. Of course, in addition to these top-down signals, which personally I find more interesting, we also have like inherent biases in our perceptual systems to favor those things that through evolution we've learned to possibly be relevant or to behavior, to survival. So loud, big, shiny, fast things also will sort of tend to beat out competition during the perceptual processing. And we know a lot about this kind of model and its details in the brain. So here's just some highlights. For example, we know since the work of Maurizio Corbetta what this kind of network looks like in terms of imaging from PET, and then subsequently many other groups have shown this kind of dorsal frontoparietal network involved in orienting attention, and we know that this network is very similar to networks that are organizing spatially directed action, and especially the ocular motor system, for example. We know from the work of people like Steve Hilliard, going back to the 70s, in the case of audition, a bit later with vision, that the information processing from early stages is changed as a function of whether something is relevant or not relevant, expected or unexpected. We've presumed that these dorsal networks are influencing these, in the case visual or other sensory networks. But we also have causal evidence from people like Christian Ruff, who spoke to us also yesterday, and also our group when I was working with Matthew Rushworth, where you see that interference methods that interfere with this frontoparietal network then change perceptual processing. And we can watch the brain in this moment of anticipation, in this moment of preperception. And in the human brain, one of the most prevalent things is that we have modulation of those initial rhythms that Berger first demonstrated, the alpha rhythms, which are not just an idling rhythm, but actually change in a graded way and in a spatially specific way to regulate excitability, for example, in different sensory organs, especially in vision. And we can use things like multivariate pattern analysis to watch the brain pre-activate those things that it's expecting or that will be important to guide perception and action later, and thereby providing an edge to those items during this kind of perceptual competition. So this is great. This is a really nice, great model. We know a lot underneath all these sort of principles that I described in the human brain. We know a lot from the cellular and systems level mechanisms from work on non-human primates, for example. But if you really think about attention as what I think about it as the prioritization and selection of information to guide adaptive behavior, you realize that there are some really severe shortcomings and limitations to this model. First of all, it's static, it has no memory, it's amnesic, and it's kind of stuck in acting at these perceptual here and now kind of moments. So my talk today is basically to blow out and expand this concept of how prioritization and selection of information processing to guide adaptive behavior, what dimensions it really does have in the human brain. So first of all, attention is dynamic. Everything about attention is dynamic. It's about this ongoing prioritization of things. The world is ever changing. We're always changing within the world, and so the relationship of us to the world is in constant flux. Yet, what we have from this attention model is this snapshot of the brain pre-activating some receptive field-based properties like some spatial locations or some features, and that's it. But yet, things are evolving. So I became kind of interested in seeing whether we could reintroduce or introduce the temporal dimension into attention. And the temporal dimension in attention was recognized. Everything has always been recognized more than 100 years before if you just read some great papers. So Wundt in the 1800s, 1874, described how if people are prepared for knowing when things would happen, they could react more quickly. And then Woodrow also did a lot of beautiful psychophysics work in the early 1900s. Then there were some valiant attempts in the 60s to resuscitate timing by Mary Reese Jones. But somehow the time dimension never really made it into these kind of standard models of attention. So we started working on this in 98. I started working on this, well, actually before, but our first paper came out in 98 with Jenny Kuhl. And this is probably one of the most heartwarming things that has happened in my career, is that we feel like we finally were able to give time some traction in the literature. So now the field of temporal expectation or temporal orienting of attention is really, really burgeoning, and it's a really, really super active field. It's a huge field. And the corollary of that, the sad side of that, is that I'm not going to be able to do any justice to this huge field at all. I just want to convince you that timing is important and that it actually does work within the attention framework. Okay, so what we've learned so far since the 90s when we started working on this is actually that rather than attention to time or temporal expectations being a monolithic concept, being only one kind, that there's probably a variety of different types of temporal expectation which may actually work through different mechanisms in the brain. So, for example, we have some temporal associations between things. So, traffic lights are a good example. You kind of have certain signals, and the amber light, you have a temporal expectation of when green is going to happen. And we have things that are very prevalent in our life, which are just ongoing rhythms. So there's the rhythm of my voice, there's rhythm of walking, all kinds of things that give you waves of information coming in, relevant information coming in to the brain, and this is represented here by this faucet. Then there are contexts in which you know something is going to happen, and the things happening have a certain temporal profile. So I've given this example here of this, watching this little girl, playing around with this balloon, you kind of know that something imminent is, more and more likely to happen within that context. And finally, there are very complex sequences of events, like in music and things, that also have a lot of temporal information. So can this temporal structure actually do anything can we extract it in the first place, and does it actually do anything to guide perception and action? So Jenny Kuhl, when she was a research fellow at the Phil, at the time when Andreas was nursing his hangover, and we kind of adapted the Posner spatial orienting task to look at temporal expectations. And this is the simplest kind of version of the task, and this is just like presenting a cue that provides information about when exactly a target would happen. So it could be 80% likely to happen early, like 300 milliseconds later, and if it didn't happen then, it would happen like at 1500 milliseconds on 20% of the remaining trials. Or you have a cue that said it'll happen late. Occasionally it would be invalidly presented early, but most likely to occur late. And you can look at this in terms of the actual instantaneous probabilities, and you can see that at the short time interval, there's this big difference in the probability of the event occurring, but because time is weird, once time passes, then things become 100% predictable at the end. So the manipulation is really at that first interval. I should also say that we use probability cues, but you can also do this with just equiprobable events and just signaling which thing is relevant for the person to do behavior. So there's a beautiful work by Marisa Carrasco's lab just published showing some really nice behavioral effects in that case. So it's not just about expectation, it's expectation and or relevance. And if you use tasks like this, you get huge effects of performance. So this was a very simple task that we started off with, and you have these enormous reaction time differences for things that you're expecting at the early interval. You're much faster than if something happens at an interval and you're not expecting it. So as I mentioned, most of the manipulation happens at this short interval, and at the long interval in this case, because everything's equally likely, things are all the same. And I'm just going to show you some examples of different contexts in which we see these effects. So here's a very simple task that stresses reaction time. If you use temporal cues in tasks that actually stress perceptual discrimination, like presenting targets embedded within a rapid serial visual presentation stream, and basically do the same kind of manipulation, you now not only get these huge behavioral reaction time effects, but you actually start improving the quality of perception. So you get big D prime effects. So you can isolate things from this kind of temporal competition from other distractors. You don't have to use cues. You can just embed targets in blocks of trials. You can just have different conditional probabilities of when things will happen. So this is a study done by André Cravo when he was a visiting student in the lab, has set up his lab in Brazil, has come back as a visiting research fellow, has just gone back again. And he just manipulated, in this case, the likelihood that a target would occur once a trial started in a block, so that in one block it was likely to happen early, 1.5 seconds later, then more likely to happen earlier, then very unlikely to happen in the middle, like 2.5, and then very likely again to happen 3.5. And in another block, it was very unlikely to happen early, and then the probability increased. And again, if you calculate how those conditional probabilities actually change to cumulative probabilities, you see that most of the exciting difference happens here in the early period, and things start equating as time passes later on. And again, you see very strong changes in reaction times on the right, but also in hits accuracy on the left. So this is, again, changing sort of the quality of your perception. Same thing happens if you embed stimuli. Again, sort of in this case, we're using sort of Gabor grating stimuli embedded within patches of Gaussian noise that occur on either a completely regular beat or at an irregular beat. And we equate everything around the target, so there's nothing funky going on in terms of the actual interval preceding the target. And this was work done by Gustavo Roenkohl, who, when he was a graduate student in the lab, he's now a postdoc with Pascal Fries, and André, who you've already been introduced to, and Valentin Villard, who's set up his lab in France now. And here again, you see that if we look at performance to discriminate targets of different contrasts, which are equated by individuals, we see that the threshold for detecting these is improved by rhythms, and also your reaction time is improved, sped up. And again, we can do some diffusion modeling, and we can show that the contrast sensitivity and the signal-to-noise ratio is improved in these cases. So hopefully this kind of gives you a sense that, this is a really strong, robust thing. It can have not just reaction time effects, but also affects the quality of your perception in many different types of temporal expectation manipulations. So what happens in the brain? So I'm just going to give you a couple of snapshots of what we've kind of found. So the first thing we did back then with Jenny was to do some imaging. Actually, we did this with PET. That's how long ago this started. And we also did a PET and a replication with MR in the same study. And using tasks like the temporal orienting network, we compared it to spatial orienting, and we identified a selective sort of temporal orienting network. This is a meta-analysis which is very similar to our original results, and it's actually based on a lot of work that Jenny, in particular, has continued to do subsequently. And she's done lots of beautiful work looking at temporal orienting with MRI and controlling lots of factors in terms of responsive vectors, perceptual demands, the ways in which the temporal cues are presented, etc. And here I think this is still a work in progress kind of picture, but one interesting thing that emerges is that whereas in spatial attention, as I mentioned, we have this kind of activation of dorsal frontoparietal areas which we think are related to spatially guided action, and in particular the ocular motor system. And the ocular motor system has very strong spatial precision and is very good for maintaining and manipulating spatial representations dynamically in rapid scales. What we see in the temporal orienting is a left-sided network, including a different group of frontoparietal areas which look more like the areas that are involved in manual control, which are areas that have very strong temporal information, temporal precision. And we think that maybe these networks are scaffolding temporal orienting in an analogous way as to the ocular motor system might be helping contribute to spatial orienting. But I think we're still trying to understand the extent to which this is really the source or some kind of network that's affected in these tasks. So personally, I have actually moved a little bit, not away, but more into trying to look at these kind of dynamic signals of prioritization. So the first thing that we did ages ago on that side was using some high temporal resolution methods, and this was done with Carlo Miniusi when he was a postdoc in the lab. I think he's director of the Trento Brain and Mind Center now. And what we saw is that we used just a very simple temporal cueing thing, and we saw that the temporal cues, depending on whether in red they signal that the target would occur early or in gray that it would occur later, actually elicit this well-known contingent negative variation in ERP that's linked to anticipation and preparation of events. But what it does is it changes the time course of that, so that if you're expecting something early, the CNV develops more rapidly and actually peaks earlier and at the time of the expected event than if you're expecting something later, then the CNV develops with a slower time course. So this suggests that temporal information is dynamically and in an anticipatory way preparing somehow the brain for incoming informations at different moments. So now I'm going to skip like over millions of beautiful work by many different groups, and I'm just going to give you one example of one study that I think at least is easy to understand and shows kind of the power of sort of these temporal signals pretty well. So this is a study in which we manipulated spatial information and also temporal information about the movement of items across a display. So a person would see a display, they'd fixate in the center, a little ball would appear and would jump across the display, would pass behind an occluder, and then would reappear, and the person would have to respond and make a discrimination on the appearance of this item after the occluder. And we manipulated spatial or temporal expectation by, in the left, for example, just presenting the items sequentially in predictable locations, or unpredictable locations so that you wouldn't know where it would come out. And then we would also manipulate time by presenting the items like exactly with the same rhythm or with different durations and different rhythms, so that either you knew exactly when it would appear or you didn't know exactly when it would appear. And if you do this, again, this was a kind of simple early task, we have strong reaction time effects either for spatial information or for temporal information, about the same amount of benefit for either of them, compared to the neutral case in gray where you have not much information. And then you do a bit better if you get both. But the interesting thing happens, like if you record EEG from that target re-emerging from the occluder, and what you see is that for, actually in this case for temporal information, in this very simple task, we didn't see any very early modulation of the earliest visual responses. There were lots of modulations that happened just later, starting about 150 or 200 milliseconds, but the earliest visual response was unaffected in this task. If we had spatial information, we have a typical modulation of the early P1 potential, and we can see that it's localized, well-behaved on the head where it should be, showing that things that are spatially anticipated elicit larger responses than unanticipated things. And this is a very subtle manipulation compared to usual cueing tasks, because you're bootstrapping these expectations on the fly. But the really nice thing is that if you now add temporal information to spatial information, so if you know both where and when something is going to happen, that boost of attention, of spatial attention, is really largely magnified. So it suggests that temporal information doesn't just blast the whole perceptual system to change everything at a given moment in time if it doesn't have much other information to work with, but as soon as you can nudge some spatial receptive fields or perhaps also feature-based receptive fields, then that process is magnified to occur at the right time so that you have a really enormous boost of the effect. In some cases, we do see temporal expectations working on their own, but this is just to make the point that we have these very strong modulatory effects which sometimes interact with other biases. Then sometime later, we replicated and extended this experiment, and this was done again by Gustavo when he was a graduate student in the lab. And we just did the same thing, but just looked at what happens as these targets are going under the occluder. So when nothing is happening on the screen, and you're either in a state of temporal expectation or not. So in one case, the ball has just been moved rhythmically, and you kind of anticipate when it's going to happen. Or the other case, it's been moving erratically, so you don't have a very good temporal anticipation of when it's going to happen. So here's, in that study, we had a final jump of the ball before the occluder. Then there was an invisible jump under the occluder, and then the target appeared. And if you then record the EEG and see what happens, we wondered, would we see any temporal structuring of those anticipatory effects for spatial attention, which I told you in the beginning, we have very prominent alpha band modulation in spatial attention. And here's the finding. I think it's really clear. What you see is when nothing is happening on the screen, if you compare temporal precise versus temporal neutral cases, and you do a subtraction, you can see that the alpha band, when nothing is happening, still maintains this temporal structure, so it's kind of pulsating, following the rhythm of what happened before in order to put the brain in that right state of excitability for when the event is going to happen. Okay, so that was just a small cameo through that, and so hopefully I've convinced you that temporal expectations exist. There are a whole bunch of them. They can enhance perception and quality of our perception and speed of our action. They generate these dynamic anticipatory biases which can be very temporally precise and influence neural processing in many different ways. I just showed you a couple of examples. And they can actually influence information processing to the target at many different stages. Okay, so attention also has memory. So in most of our attention tasks, what we do is we give people a set of instructions saying this is relevant, this is irrelevant, or we give them cues that suggest when the relevant thing is going to happen, and everything happens in the here and now in these tasks. But in reality, our predictions don't really come from cues that we just heard about or instructions that were given by strangers as we navigate through the world, but they actually come from the repository of experiences that we have and that we carry around with us. So we wondered whether long-term memories are able also to generate these proactive anticipatory biases. So incredibly, the fields of attention and long-term memory are enormous magnums in the field, but they don't crosstalk very much. Of course, there is some crosstalk, and so there's some notable wonderful work. For example, Moshe Bar talks about contextual priming and talks about how you're much better at understanding what this stimulus is if it appears within a context that kind of uses your memories to guide your understanding of that item. And also there's the work by Marvin Chun, for example, showing that your performance in visual search tasks not only improves in general as you get better at the task, that you actually also are much faster if the array of targets inadvertently is kind of also repeated. So even if you're not aware of that, that memory for that distractor configuration gives you an advantage. So we wanted to take these concepts and create a kind of task that would enable us to study whether and how the brain is creating these anticipatory biases based on memories to guide perception. So of course, memory changes our perception of things because it creates a different state of synaptic weights in the brain. So obviously, memory has a consequence on how things are processed once they're in, but the question is, does it also generate proactive anticipatory biases that are live to influence information processing? So in our task, this is actually just me picking up making these some illustrative figures. It's not really what the stimuli really look like, but what we did is we presented people with scenes, and in these scenes, we embedded these very small keys. Here I'm making it huge just to make it easy for you. And people would have to search around, and they would create a new spatial association with these items within various different scenes. These are just scenes from my own memory, sort of growing up in my college and graduate school and et cetera. And so once we've loaded up these memories in people, and we could do that with 100 memories, 200 memories, depending on which kind of task we're going to do, We then have, we obviously counterbalance which scenes are associated with which locations and which conditions. So there's nothing inherent in the scenes themselves that actually carry any information. The only thing that carries information about where targets are present are the associative memories that people form. What we find is that these kinds of tasks, again, give you very strong benefits in the quality and the speed of your performance. So in this case, this is just showing an MRI version where we actually use a very long display, and we'd present just the cue with no target embedded in it, and then the whole thing would go away, and then it would reappear quickly with or without a target, and people had to make a discrimination. And people are much better to identify this target if it appears at a previously remembered location than if it appears at the unremembered location. And we can watch the brain in this state of anticipation elicited by memories and see what it's doing. And if you look at the MRI results, we see our old friend, the frontoparietal network, but we also see areas related to scene construction and memory coming in, joining forces with this frontoparietal network to influence perception. And here I'd like to make the point that whereas, I think sometimes we think of these resting state networks as kind of Lego networks that we cycle through, what actually also happens in tasks is that these things come together and come apart, and there's confluence and divergence dynamically always in time. So we need to think also flexibly about the nature of those resting state and active state networks as well. So we can watch that, and we can also see the modulation in anticipation of the target in visual areas arising, so that the areas in the visual system that are where the targets are expected are revved up according to the spatial biases to anticipate those events. So recently, we've become interested in whether our memories actually also carry temporal information about when events occur. So we've developed a task. So then this is again done by André when he was visiting the lab at the time. And in this task, what we did is we presented scenes in which a target would appear. We actually used a cartoon figure of a little placeholder of a bomb, and then the bomb would activate, and people would have to deactivate it really quickly, and if they weren't quick enough, it would kind of explode. It's kind of not very good use these days. Bombs have become really nasty, so I kind of regret that, but we're stuck with the study as it is. I'm sure it would work with beautiful fireflies or something like that as well. We haven't done that. So in this task, for example, thing would happen, the placeholder would appear, the bomb would activate quickly, people would have to deactivate it, and it would happen either at a precise short interval or in some cases at some cases it would take longer, and you'd have to wait until it get activated and you'd respond. So we trained people on these temporal associations. We did it deliberately very impoverished stimuli because all we wanted to do was to create the temporal association and not have anything moving where we create an association that might reflect spatial sequences, for example. So the only thing that's relevant here is when this target occurs. We had to show first that people can learn these associations, and people get better to do this over time, and they also can respond accurately as to what the timing was. And then we can use the same idea. We use those cues to provide the scenes, to provide memory cues. And again, we see very strong both quality and speed of perception is enhanced by these memory cues. So these memories are also carrying real specific temporal information about when events are likely to happen, so that you're better at perceiving an item and discriminating it if it occurs at the same time in which you're used to it occurring in memory than before. And if we do some EEG on it, again, we can see, if we present these scenes, we can see if the scene is associated with a target happening early in red or late in gray. We can see that even at the initial scene presentation, you already start developing these different anticipatory biases and time the CNV, so that, and happens even before that the placeholder item happens. And then again, you're sort of more prepared for the target item occurring. And we can show that the memory in this task correlates with the performance reaction time. The memory correlates with reaction time in the orienting task. It correlates with the depth of the CNV, and the depth of the CNV also correlates with reaction time. So this, again, suggestive that your memories are proactively shaping your perception, and it's also doing it in a temporally precise manner when you do have temporally precise associations. So this makes us think of memory as prospective, not just as a retrospective function. and as proactive, and again, as it being able to enhance the quality of our perception, the speeds of our actions, and that it generates it just doesn't change the state of the brain as it's dormant in its synaptic weight things, but it's also proactively generating these anticipatory biases, which can carry also dynamic information, and it can influence neural processing from early on. Okay, so the final cameo here is that, like Billy Pilgrim, attention is unhinged in time. So we tend to study attention. We're obsessed with looking at how early does attention act. Is it happening early in the thalamus or in the superior colliculus or in V1? So we're kind of within perception, and occasionally people look at it acting on motor systems or sensory motor associations, and increasingly now in choice making computations. But presumably, we can also use the prioritization and selection of information in things that are away from the world and just exist in our memory. So working memory is a really robust sort of function in the brain which maintains items even after they've disappeared from the sensory environment in order to bridge information to guide our adaptive action. And interestingly, if we go to the sort of textbook view of working memory, we see it as a it's a very limited function. You can only maintain a few things in it. It's very robust interference, but it's highly inflexible. So the canonical studies are studies like Sperling well, I guess his is kind of the dominant study, but then also Sternberg and things, which showing that basically you can't enhance performance by prompting people to respond to one item from an array as opposed to just getting to them to respond to all items that they have in working memory. So these post cues he showed didn't work. So whereas they worked very early on for iconic memory and also for perception, they didn't work for working memory. And this kind of got the field stuck in this idea of working memory being really inflexible for a very long time. So the idea is that you have all those representations there and you shuffle through the right one until you prioritize it. There are a lot of relationships that have been proposed between working memory and attention. So, for example, our goal-based representations in short-term and working memory bias perception. This is the bias competition model. And of course, it's those things that are selected from perception which come to occupy working memory. And in some cases, people feel that that is what actually makes working memory and maintains working memory. But the idea that things that are represented in working memory themselves were inflexible and impervious to these biases. So coincidentally, both my group and also Victor Lame's group at the same time, we kind of went back and revisited this it was like a real dogma, and we found that this dogma was not true. And actually, if you present a cue that predicts where something that is going to be relevant to you lives within your working memory, that does actually give you really strong performance benefits. And this is one of those things that, like when I present this to neuroscientists, they say, well, what's so interesting about that? Of course, that's the way it works. But if you presented it to the psychology people, they really wanted to burn you at the stake. I mean, it was really one of those dogmas that could not be broken. And I literally did have, lots of silverbacks yelling at me about this. But by now this is a really established finding, and we use these things called retrocues, which we say provide retroactive or retrodictive information about where the relevant item is going to be. And the only trick, I mean, obviously those old studies weren't wrong, but the only trick is you need to give time for the cues to work. So you have to give a cue. The cue needs a few hundred milliseconds to do its prioritization and selection, and then boom, you get these really big effects. So this is an example of this kind of study that we do nowadays. So we can present 4 items in an array, and then we present a cue, and then we wait, and then we present a probe, and in this case they had to make a judgment on whether the thing was rotated clockwise or counterclockwise, or we actually probe the memory right here. So if it was just about not letting things decay, then you should be better when you're probed early on without a cue than if you cued, you have to wait, and then things might decay a bit later. But actually, that's not what you see. As soon as you have this retro cue, your performance in blue, your performance is much better than if you're actually cued, if you're prompted early, so that things presumably should not have decayed so much, and that's in the dashed black line. And obviously also better than if you present a neutral cue in the middle that doesn't provide any information. So again, now there's like a huge industry of work trying to understand what are the mechanisms of these retrocues, and I'm just going to show you a couple of things to make just an illustration. So for example, if you do MEG using these kinds of tasks, this is just a replication of the same kind of behavioral patterns that I showed you before with retrocues or pre-cues before the array, giving you large accuracy and reaction time advantages. But if you're doing MEG, so this is work by George Wallace, who was a graduate student with Mark Stokes, who's now a professor at Oxford, and me. What we see is that after a retrocue, you have this kind of dynamic pulsing of excitability change within the sensory areas. So what you have is, again, a modulation of that alpha band activity that happens after the retrocue, and it changes the excitability, like enhancing excitability at the areas coding the relevant information. And interestingly, for working memory aficionados, this is like a dynamic effect and not a sustained effect. So it's like something happens, it changes the prioritization state, and now the brain is kind of ready to react to the stimulus as it comes along. So again, in this case, we became interested in is like, does this also carry not just proactive modulation, but does this also carry temporal information as to when you need to use the working memory information? So this is the final study that I'll show you. And this was by Freek van Ede, who's a Marie Curie fellow currently in the lab. And in this task, what Freek did is he presented two stimuli, one on the left, one on the right, and one was always kind of yellowy orange, and the other one was blue, and they could happen on either side. But people knew that so they saw these two things, they encoded it into working memory, and they would be probed at some point in time about one of them. And they just learned through the task that if they were probed early on, like about a second and a half later, they would be most, in this case for this subject, most likely probed about the yellow. So the idea would be the person would shift attention in mind to the thing on the left in this trial. But if nothing happened and time passed, there's no external marker of time, it's just time is just in the head, then the thing would happen late and the person would shift to the other side and be able to presumably respond better to now the blue item. And then they had some moment to deliberate. When they were ready to go, they'd press the mouse button and they would reproduce the orientation of the stimulus. So does proactive temporal signals also work in working memory to sort of guide when you use information in working memory over time? And of course the answer is yes, or else I wouldn't be telling you this. And the behavioral data are really impressive. So people are better, faster to respond to the item that they're anticipating early on, and then the item that they're anticipating late. But they don't lose the late item, because as soon as time passes, nothing happens. Now they're really good at the late time interval to respond to that. And you get the complementary pattern of findings with the accuracy as well. So whereas people are have a very small error to the attended thing and much bigger error to the other one, as time passes, again, they recover that information, and now they're just as good at the other one. So they're just bringing things into mind at the right time as they need it based on these learned temporal associations. And this also happens, the alpha band association. The alpha band activation is also happening in time and synchrony, shifting to change excitability in one side of the brain to the other at the different moments in time. So I'm just going to skip the details just because I'm out of time. So hopefully you kind of have an inkling that attention can operate not just in the here and now, but it can also operate in working memory. Arguably, long-term memory selective retrieval is an act of attention. You could think of it that way. And again, it enhances perception and action, and it generates these dynamic biases that carry also temporal information. And again, it can influence many stages of processing. Okay, so that was kind of the panoramic sampling through the thing. So now coming back to where we were, bringing it back to the standard model of attention, we had this great start. Hopefully, now you'll agree with me that we've kind of added some power to it, so that we now also have a system that we can think of as dynamic, temporally precise, having memory, and also acting at multiple timescales, including away from the here and now. And so if we were to sort of think about this kind of model from James, we can now understand that attention actually works on many different types of bias information coming from many different sources, working on many different timescales and substrates. And if we think about it that way, then it maybe is it's useful to think about attention not as a domain or as a specific set of cognitive functions, but as a property of how cognitive systems operate to facilitate behavior. It may be carrying not just our goals, but a motivational state, emotional states, and lots of other biases to influence all different aspects of our cognition. So with that, I will thank you and close. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was multimodal, multi-domain, just as we had hoped for, and as I think really emblematic for this community. Just to save my reputation, I actually had the desk next to Jenny Kuhl at that time, and I was nursing her hangovers when Kia would come in to discuss the data. So I think in the interest of preparing the next session, I would suggest we don't take questions, but I think Kia is happy to linger around here in the front area if some of you want to come up and discuss and ask specific questions. So I'd just like to invite you to one final hand to thank Kia for this lecture.